Hello and welcome to the Red Mountain Community Church podcast, where you can hear conversations with the people of Red Mountain Community Church as we pursue Jesus together. Each episode highlights what God is doing in someone's life or a specific theme in light of what God has revealed in the Bible. I'm Peter Franson, one of the elders at Red Mountain Community Church and your fellow seat warmer. I was told that I should maybe add that back into the script, and I forgot to mention that I'm a seat warmer, but I am also still your fellow seat warmer at Red Mountain Community Church. My co-host today is Kenny Walmsley, our pastor of junior high ministry. Kenny, thank you for joining me again.
No problem.
So for those who don't know, particularly I would think those that don't have a connection to youth ministry might not know this.
Yeah.
You and your wife, Sarah, about a month ago, brought home your baby that you guys, is KJ, is that his name, or is there a longer name, or what's
There's definitely a longer name. We were going to originally just name him KJ.
Okay.
To represent Kenny Jr., because I was really against naming him Kenneth Lee Walmsley Jr.
Okay.
But we realized we didn't like a standalone. Specifically, Sarah didn't like a standalone, and it started to feel weird. So they're like, what should his middle name be, but also keeping KJ?
Okay.
And then we decided on James. And so he's Kenneth James Walmsley.
Nice.
So we just call him KJ.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that I always like when I see the prayer request emails, it says just always refers to him as baby KJ. Mm-hmm. And so I've always been wondering. But on that subject, because people in the church, we've been praying for you guys for a while now. For those who don't know, can you give a brief snapshot of KJ's condition? What's going on with that for those who have no idea what we're talking about? And then, let's just start there.
Yeah, so there's a few things that are challenges for him. One of the first ones being that my wife's water broke at 22 weeks.
Okay.
And so that stalls out his development, and all development stops when the water breaks. But he was still in there. We were able to push him out further to where we can actually naturally birth him. But when he was born, he had a premature chronic lung disease, so his lungs weren't fully developed.
Okay.
Oftentimes they would collapse, not in the way we think of a collapse, but they would just stick shut, and so that caused a lot of problems. He would need to be intubated, which then further pushes back his development. And then pretty early on, some signs showed of a condition called DeGeorge.
Okay.
It's called DeGeorge syndrome. That's one of its shorthand names. If you've ever heard of cleft palate or anything like that, typically a kid has DeGeorge.
Okay.
And for him, we're not quite sure what that means. His growth could be stunted. His ears could be low set. He can get very fatigued very fast. We're pretty sure he has that.
Okay.
He has an autoimmune condition. And he also has, I'm not going to attempt to try to say it because it doesn't really make sense, but he needs calcium and active vitamin D for the rest of his life.
Okay.
Because his body does not have the ability to do that.
Okay.
And if you take that away, he'll have tremors and that kind of thing, and probably more muscle aches.
Okay.
And that kind of stuff. Also, he was born with a heart defect, which is a symptom of DeGeorge, where his aortic arch goes across the body. It's supposed to bend basically back into your heart. It goes across his spine and down the other side.
Oh.
And what can happen with that is a vein can go across the trachea, your windpipe.
Okay.
And what that does is then constrict the windpipe, because it creates this ring. It's called a vascular ring.
Okay.
So they had to shrink that, and it's still there, but he may need surgery. He may never need surgery.
Okay.
But that's the thing, is it grows and it can start to restrict the airway and make it harder to breathe for him. And as he gets bigger, that ring stays the same size, and so then it cuts off that. And then later on, because he's immunocompromised, he got a lot of sicknesses, which then he was working on breathing harder. And so in order for him to grow, he had to get a tracheostomy. And for those who don't know what tracheostomy is, they they put a hole in your neck and put a tube down so you can breathe properly and focus on the things that you need to focus on, like growing.
Yeah.
So he needed to use his calories to grow, and he wasn't doing that. So that's kind of his history, and caring for him means that we have a lot of baggage with us when we go around: a ventilator, oxygen tank. We have to monitor his oxygen. He can't really, I'd say he can't spit on his own. He gets kind of fluid buildup around the trach. We have to suck that out.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of things that come for caring for him. He can't be by himself ever. And so that stuff well, he's a kid. He shouldn't be by himself ever. But so there's a lot of care and time and things that we had to get heavily trained to take care of him. And but we have him home for a month, and it's been a huge blessing.
Yeah.
He's gotten nothing but better. Like I was telling you before we started recording, he went from probably around the 20th percentile in weight, and now he's in the 60th percentile.
Oh, that's great.
And so he's growing rapidly.
That's great.
And that was week 3. And so
wow.
he's a joy to be around. He's a very happy kid.
Oh, that's great.
And he's probably, I have top 3 blessings in my life: following Jesus, my wife, and my baby KJ.
So now, I told you a number of months ago, I shared a picture when I was 2.5 that I had a trach tube because of a disease I had. But
you got to get a popsicle though with yours.
Yes, there was a popsicle in the photo. Yeah. But that was, I think I'd have to ask my parents, but I mean, that was not like months that I had to have mine in. So do you have an idea of like how long he's going to need that trach tube for?
So the trach tube itself is estimated 2 to 3 years.
Okay. Gotcha.
So it's a long-term thing. Even though medically it's short term.
Yeah.
But the other things around that could be shorter. So the ventilator can go away. His need for being given oxygen can go away once he starts being able to breathe.
Okay.
Just at room air. Naturally, we have 21% oxygen in the air, and that's what we breathe on. Once he gets to that, certain things could possibly go away.
Okay.
The trach, though, will have to be there for a while just to continue to give him a stable airway so his body and his lungs can begin to sync up.
Gotcha.
Because that's part of the issue, is that his lungs are still catching up to his body.
Okay, gotcha. So then what can those listening just be praying for in the coming weeks and months, do you think, for you and Sarah and KJ?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing right now is finding a day nurse. It's very hard to find day nurses that can only work minimal hours because they also have other people that they work for as well. Yeah. And we need complex care. Like, we can't just have a regular nurse come in.
Oh, yeah.
Because then we're the ones who have to train them and do all the things where that's okay every once in a while, but it can get difficult when we know more than the nurse that's coming in. So we just pray for that we can find that nurse that fits our family too. We've been lucky enough that our night nurse is a believer, and she's willing and ready to care for KJ all the hours. So it's really cool to have her. Wow. And then I would say just mine and Sarah's patience during this time. It can be really easy not to grow impatient with KJ, although it seems like it in the moment, because he won't take his binky. He's being fussy, but really what we're growing is impatient with ourselves because we can't quite fix the problem that's happening. Yeah, because we're still learning to be parents, because we went 7 months without actually parenting him in our home. So now we have him full time, and it's such a learning curve. Like, it's a learning curve with a child who doesn't have all the things he has. Yeah. Now we're going through the same learning curve on top of that, also still learning all the things that come with that. And he can be extremely particular, which is another thing that George can happen. It can be extremely particular as well. Okay. And so he already shows signs of that particularness. And so it can get pretty frustrating because I don't know how to take care of him in the moment. And I don't want to take care of him out of frustration, because that won't go well. And so just the patience that Sarah and I can have for each other, but also mostly for ourselves. And that he just and the other prayers is that he continues to grow and thrive, because that's just what's happening. The Lord has blessed him and blessed us with the home that we have, and we're so grateful for the life that we have, despite the hardship that it is. It took a while to get there, to get to that place of like, this is a blessing. But why else would the Lord give us this child? All good and perfect gifts come from the Lord, and that's what he is. So just continue to pray that that we can operate from the Spirit in our parenting.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Kenny. Appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. So now there's no great transition to go from those weighty things.
And trust me, it happens in public too, and people ask us about KJ and then try to ask us other questions. So it's totally fine.
Okay. So now the completely superfluous, if I'm using that word correctly, the irresistible question. Here we go, Kenny. What was something, a food or activity, that you reluctantly tried and ended up liking?
Oh.
Ding, ding, ding.
Dude, I don't know.
You got something I can keep singing?
That's such a hard question. A food or something that I tried that I ended up liking. You know what? Kombucha.
What did you just say?
Kombucha. It's a probiotic drink. It actually has a lot of things in it. Before I met my wife, I hated kombucha. And I know hate's a strong word, but I would act like no. And then met my wife. Maybe it's the Lord's blessing. I tasted one that she had when we were dating, and it was amazing.
What part of the world is this from?
Sprouts.
But you said kombucha.
It's just it's a plant that produces like live cultures, probiotics, and that kind of thing. And it has multiple benefits. It's like, so for me, I'm lactose intolerant. My wife thinks I may have IBS. Maybe that's too much information. That's okay. But it regulates my digestive tract to where I can actually process dairy well, or if I decide to eat too much ice cream, and keep it at bay, you know?
That's right, yeah.
But kombucha is really good to just keep drinking on a regular basis. It's kind of like, I don't know, it'd be like taking your vitamins. Like you take vitamins on a regular basis to keep your health up. If you take it once, it doesn't really matter if you never take it again.
What does it taste like? Is it multiple flavors?
It's slightly fermented, not enough to be carded for it, but but they have peach, they have blackberry, and over the years, since I've married her, they've created more flavors.
Does it taste at all like it has alcohol in it?
No.
Okay.
It just tastes like I would say like a sparkling water, but more flavored.
Okay.
And it packs more of a bite too. Like when you taste it, like you're like you kind of have to draw back if you've never tasted it.
Okay.
But it has apple cider vinegar in it. You've probably heard of that. Like,
interesting.
But it's really good for you.
All right.
So
nice.
That would be the thing I would say.
Cool. Not as good for you that I came around to enjoying was first-person shooters. I've
always loved those, so I've never.
I grew up playing like Final Fantasy and like Dragon Warrior, like turn-based old school RPGs, because I'm not good with like hand-eye coordination and like action. So like I grew up. I mean, I remember some of the Atari era, but mostly like the original Nintendo. And my sisters were so much better at Super Mario Brothers than I was. And I would just keep falling into the same pit again and again and again. It would start me over. And I'm like, I want to see this world. I want to explore it. So I just hated games that gave you a game over or a fail state for failing with your hands. And so I just assumed for the longest time, well, those cool looking first person shooters, they'll never be for me. They're just clearly all action-y. Yeah. But then they started making games with difficulty settings, like in the Xbox 360 era. Mm-hmm. And then in particular, it was BioShock. Okay, yeah. I won't get into the weeds about right now, but it's like this very atmospheric type of game with some really interesting philosophical stuff going on in it, that initially I thought was going to be hard just because it seemed scary, and I equated scary with hard. And so I tried the demo. I was like, no, can't do it. But for some reason, I heard all these accolades. Yeah. I went back to it years later and I tried it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can do this. I'm doing it.
That was me with Halo.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah, on the easiest difficulty setting for sure for me. And I still only play action games on whatever the easiest setting is. But man, then that opened up a world to me of the Far Cry games, and I could go on.
It made Pay to the Man He Is today.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Unfortunately. All right. As a reminder, you can message us on Instagram or Facebook with suggestions for fun things that we could do or talk about before the interview, if you don't want me talking about video games. But for now, we're going to move things along. You know, I still might talk about video games. That might be unavoidable. Anyway, but we are going to move along for now. Just a little while ago, Kenny and I spent some time talking with James Nieman. If that name is not familiar to you, then you might be more familiar with the saxophone player that we occasionally see up front on the worship team. That's James playing saxophone. And we had a great conversation with him that touched on so many different aspects of his life. I think there's a lot of things that a lot of different people will be able to appreciate and relate to and benefit from hearing. So enjoy this conversation. Well, James, thank you so much for braving the microphones with me and Kenny. I just want to say that you know this, but I still kind of like every once in a while I remember that, oh my gosh, that's right, James went to Red Mountain High School with my sister and like sat next to her and played saxophone with her, which is so crazy. So can you give me kind of like I've been looking forward to this because I know you from just kind of being on worship team with you, but you're a very quiet, reserved, humble guy. You're not the type that's going to like be like a big gabber. And so I just think we're going to get into some stuff about James that James would not normally just like blah, blah, blah and share about himself. So I've been looking forward to just kind of getting to know these other facets of you. But I want you to start by just giving like a snapshot of what your current stage of life looks like in terms of work, family, kids, ages, whatever, those kinds of details.
So I'm my wife Rachel and I are married, and we have 4 kids. Esther, who's 22, and is a single mom with us, and then my daughter Sarah, who's married to Reed Copeland. So Sarah and Reed Copeland. Sarah's 21, and then Judah, who seems like everyone knows Judah Nieman. He is just finished his 2nd year at GCU. And then our youngest, Gideon, who lives at home, and he'll be a senior this next year in high school.
Okay. And what kind of like work do you do, or how do you fill your days?
Yeah, and I am a house painter by day. My dad and I are paint contractors.
Does that mean like exterior, interior?
Yeah, all of it. We paint
of it. Okay.
Insides, outsides, commercial, residential. If it needs to be painted, we can do it.
Okay. How long you been doing that for?
Gosh, since I was a kid. My dad has been a painter all my life. So, 12, 13, 14 years old, I would go to work with my dad, on weekends or maybe in the summer. But I officially started at 16 this summer after my sophomore year of high school. I got on at Farnsworth Construction, where my dad used to work back then.
Okay.
And actually started working as a painter, and we've been self-employed since 2007. So
nice.
We owned our own company.
Nice. Outdoors in the summer, though, that's got to be hard.
We try in the summer to do as much inside as we can.
Okay, yeah.
Sometimes you just got to do what you got to do.
Yeah.
That's all there is.
Wow. Okay, so how would you describe the kind of home that you grew up in, and what your childhood was generally like? And if you want, along the way, you can mention whether or not church was a factor in that. Did you guys go to church, or what kind of church, or whatever?
Church was definitely a big part of our life. I've always felt very fortunate. I was blessed with Christian parents who loved the Lord, and it's funny, I remember we attended this one church. It was a small church, and someone made the comment that we were the first normal family because we were the only family in the church where the husband and wife and children were all together.
Oh.
That we weren't like a split home, which...
Oh, wow.
And apparently, because for that, like everyone in that church, that's how it was, which is normal these days. And so I always... I definitely have always been, very blessed and very, very, felt very fortunate for, having Christian parents who love the Lord and, raised us in the fear and admonition of the Lord, as they would say back then. And so, yeah.
What was the tradition of church that you grew up in?
So my parents were, they were hippies in the 70s.
Okay.
And they actually got saved in like Park Ministries in Mesa.
Park Ministries?
Yeah, like a lot of the hippies, would hang out in parks and, I don't know, play guitar and just kind of do hippie things. I guess I don't really know what all they were doing. But my parents, it's funny, my dad actually, he started getting invited to these Bible studies because my dad plays guitar.
Okay.
And so his older brother who had gotten saved would get my dad to go play guitar. And he got saved at one of those Bible studies. And then my parents met like in youth group and at a church in Mesa and got married. The old Mesa First Assembly that used to be on Robson, just south of Maine back then. And most of my childhood upbringing was predominantly, Pentecostal Assemblies of God.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
So from what I was told, you have a brother who passed away when you were still very young. Can you share just kind of generally how that happened and what kind of impact that must have had on you afterward as you were growing up?
Yeah, that definitely shaped, my life and most of my family. So I was the oldest of 4 children.
Okay.
Growing up, and so August 10th of 1989, I was 14, and on that day, like we had done so many times before, my uncle had taken me and my brother David and my cousins, and we all went down to the Salt River just to cool off because it was a hot, August day, and went down like we had done 100 times before, and we don't totally know exactly what happened or how it happened, but almost very quickly after we were there, my brother got pulled under and drowned at the Salt River. It's called Fonda Sutton. It's actually one of the last stops on the Salt River for people who tube and stuff. Okay. And I was there, and and saw it, and it was terrible. We eventually were able to get him out, but he was gone, and he was air vac'd, and the Lord was with us, and I definitely had a hard time because I was in junior high. That was the summer after my 7th grade year. I was at Fremont Junior High, and so 8th grade was really tough.
And I can't remember. Did you say this was your older or younger brother?
Younger. I was 14. David was 13.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but we were very close.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I definitely struggled in junior high. Had a hard time. But by the grace of God, they say things like that. They either destroy families or bring them close together. And by the grace of the Lord, our family just kind of clung to each other, and which is a big part of why I ended up working with my dad. He and I were really close, and people often say, "How did you end up painting?" I'm like, I just liked being with my dad, and I got to go to work with my dad, and it wasn't even like it was work. It was just I got to go spend every day with my dad, and I really always was blessed and fortunate to do that. So it's funny how that came about, Yeah.
Yeah. When do you roughly remember first hearing about Jesus? I mean, you said you were raised in the church. How did do you remember a point either that you arrived at an initial decision to put your faith in Jesus, or maybe alternatively, if that goes too far back to remember, there's a point where it's like, okay, now my faith in a fresh way is really becoming real to me at this point.
I do. It's funny that becoming a Christian is probably one of my earliest memories.
Really? Okay.
My parents would say that I was, of all of their kids, I was definitely the most sensitive about the Lord. I was very, I was very keenly aware of the Lord and just His presence and that we went to church and what we did and everything. My mom tells the story that I was 3, so I was probably almost 4 because my birthday's in March. So it was the Christmas of when I was 3. Okay. They were talking to me and it just would have been me and my brother at that time, about Christmas and what it meant and, why we celebrated Christmas and that it was the birth of Jesus and then, just with, cause my mom's a teacher, so they're always, those teaching moments with your children, and we're always talking about Jesus, and somehow it came up that I could be saved and that I could ask Him in my heart, and I said, I want to ask Jesus in my heart. And so at age 3, as much as I could have understood, my parents said that, I wanted to receive Christ, and I was, just always very, my mom says when I was little, I always pretended to be, because we probably attended a church or, in the olden days where sometimes someone would direct, the music or the worship.
Like direct the congregation?
Like to direct the congregation. Yeah. And so she says I would take spoons, like wooden spoons, and stick it in the end of the couch. And I would stand and I would lead worship at home, and I was doing that at 4 and 5, and then I would preach, and I'd be, and the Lord said, and I would stand there and I would preach, and so I just always was very, keenly aware of of the Lord and a love for the Lord and a desire for the Lord. So, but then, as you grow, obviously, you're always growing in the fear and the admonition of the Lord and following the Lord. And I know that fast forwarding up to after the death of my brother, I definitely went through a really hard time where I definitely struggled. I know, looking back, I know that I was saved and that I was in Christ. But I definitely, doubted and struggled and went through all the pain, all the emotions you can imagine, and it was definitely a dark time. But somehow, God, by His grace, He definitely got me through that. And as time went on, it got easier. And
Do you remember any of particular elements that you mentioned, as time passing, that was certainly an element. And do you remember anything in particular that was kind of helping you through that? You said your family grew closer, but what were some of the key components in your mind of just healing and restoring and moving forward?
There were a couple. Well, I can tell you, we were, we were always in church. We always went to church. My parents, just because of jobs and whatnot, we moved around different parts of Mesa, and we ended up, for different reasons, attending different churches. I wished I could say we were always at one church, but we weren't. We moved different times.
Sure.
But I know that the church we were attending, that was a really good church. They really were a blessing to our family when my brother died. But then they were in transition, and they had lost a youth pastor, and then didn't have youth for a while. And it was during that time that, when I turned 16, I started working, and I just got to where, like a lot of 16-year-olds, I just wanted to work. And I was missing church. And my parents could see that I was struggling, and they could see that, something needed to change. And we had heard about this other church that had this really thriving youth group, and so our family moved from the one church to the next church because of the youth ministry, in the hopes that I would get engaged, which didn't happen right away, but eventually. And I've always been really grateful for that, because God did use that youth pastor to really, kind of some tough love kind of actually got in my face a few times, and just really, just kind of called out, better, enough playing games, enough making excuses. It's time to serve the Lord, time to live for the Lord, and quit wasting time, And I think people who knew me and, knew that there was, that I love the Lord. And so there really was no excuse, it was like, enough's enough. And so I've always been grateful for that, because God definitely used, for that season of life, God did use that youth group. And within a couple of years, I was one of the leaders. And so I kind of went from high school right into being a youth leader. Very similar to how I am now, like a small group leader and discipling and working with young people. So
yeah. Oh man, I so commend your parents for making that choice. I mean, not knowing at all about what that choice meant to them, but when my parents brought us to Red Mountain, there were certain things about Red Mountain that were very different from what they were used to, and their comfort level and stuff like that, and what would be the ideal thing for them. But they really just had a focus on making sure that me and my sisters were going to be engaged in a church that was going to be teaching the Bible in a way that we were going to be able to connect with. And so to have parents that are willing to, and just, for that matter, just the older generation, as we all get older, to have ways where we can set aside what we want and what's ideal for us in favor of that rising generation. That is, I just so appreciate that move on your parents' part. I'm going to reframe this question because you said that you came to believe so early on. Originally, I was going to ask, do you remember anything generally or particular about yourself or your life that changed after you came to faith in Jesus? But it sounds like you barely remember anything before you came to faith.
Right.
But what maybe over the years has been kind of something about your relationship with the Lord that you know has had an impact on, a very significant impact on your life and the course of it?
So it's funny, it still kind of ties back to after the death of my brother. When I was 17, because I was still really struggling and really not strongly walking with the Lord. In fact, even like my sophomore year of high school at Red Mountain was, I was still not doing very well, making some really bad choices and driving already. So having, like a lot of young teenagers do, having those opportunities to drive and go hang out with friends and go to a party or go do this, but knowing that that's not what my parents would want me to do or what the Lord would want me to do. So fast forward to that summer so it would have been the summer after my sophomore year or maybe junior year. Sophomore year. I ended up going to youth camp with the church, and when I got there, realized I had been there before. That as a child, me and my brother had gone to that same camp.
Oh, wow.
And all these memories started coming back in and remembering him. And it was like every night, it was like as though the speaker was speaking to me. And I was, going up to the altar and responding and praying and usually weeping before the Lord and, repenting. And it was like God was just doing this work in me.
Wow.
But I remember it was like either the Wednesday or the Thursday night service, I just was completely surrendered and weeping before the Lord. And, just like, God, I've made so many mistakes. Like, looking back, like you think, gosh, well, I really didn't do anything that bad. But at 17, in comparison to how I was raised and how I knew to live, I had done a lot of stupid things. I was making a lot of bad choices that didn't honor the Lord. My parents used to say when we would leave the house, we can't see where you're going, but the Lord is watching, and just reminding us to honor them, to respect and honor the Lord, and make good choices, and so many times when I left the house, I didn't make those good choices. I wasn't honoring my parents, honoring the Lord. And so I was very convicted by that. And I hope this may come out of left field, but I'm going to be honest with you. What happened to me, I was just praying before the Lord. And I know that this was in my mind's eye, but the Lord, and I was weeping because I was like, I didn't have the assurance of faith like I know now. And so, and we can maybe talk about this more, but one of the doctrines of a lot of Pentecostals that is they believe you can lose your salvation.
Oh, okay.
And so that was one of those fear things that I often dealt with growing up.
Oh, sure.
And because we were young boys and, even though we loved the Lord and were raised in a Christian home, I mean, we still did adolescent boy things. And I always growing up had this fear that I may have done something, or what if the Lord comes back when I'm in my sleep? And I always had this fear of whether I was going to go to heaven or not. I grew up that way. And so that was a very real fear. And so I was like, is my brother in heaven? And I was just like, that was a big part of like, it was like, I was ready to serve God and do right, but God, where's my brother? And I was just, praying and kind of weeping before the Lord and just wanting his peace. And the Lord, in my mind's eye, he gave me a vision of my brother. And in the vision, it was Jesus with his arm around my brother, and my brother was cheering me on, which reminded me later of that scripture that talks about, the hosts in heaven and how they cheer us on, and the Lord did something that day. I don't want to say he completely healed me, but he touched me in such a way that when I left that camp, I was ready to serve the Lord. Wow. I was a totally different person. And it was awesome. So I've always loved like working with the youth group, and I totally get what camp experience is like and what it's like going to camp and and having those mountaintop. Obviously we don't get to live on the mountain. We live in the valley.
Yeah.
But those mountaintop experiences, they're important and they're awesome.
Yeah.
So I love seeing kids be able to go to camp and having those experiences. And I certainly had my share. And I remember, and it's hard because you say that to someone, and I remember coming back and even sharing with my family what God had done. And it kind of hurt them because they were still really dealing with the pain of my brother. And I think in my youth, I didn't really articulate it. It was like, what I was saying was, God's healed me. Like, I'm not mourning anymore. I'm not upset. Whereas they, as parents, losing your 10-year-old son, it takes a long time to heal. I would say they're still not totally healed.
Yeah.
And I know that I still, miss my brother. So it's not like the pain completely went away. But I think what I was trying to say was that there was a transformation that happened, and that God did something in me that I couldn't explain, but I was finally like ready to serve the Lord. And so it was awesome. And that was definitely a very pivotal point. And by the grace of God, for the most part, from that point forward, I did serve the Lord. I didn't, the rebellion was gone. It was just back by the middle of that next school year, I was the FCA president and leading the Christian club at school. And like people who knew me were like, always like, I remember I came back and I had this friend that I was not a very good influence in my life. And I literally told him, I can't hang out with you anymore. I am going to serve the Lord. I have to serve the Lord. You are welcome to come to church with me. You can come to my house, but I'm not going to pick you up anymore. I'm not going out to parties. I'm not doing any of the things that we used to do. And he was very angry at me and had written this big note about how he was basically going to beat me up or something. And I just, whatever you need to do, but I do love you, but I'm going to serve the Lord, and I need to. And by the grace of God, so there were a lot of those things, that real turnaround where it's like, okay, enough's enough. I'm not playing games. And, so there was actually a period of time where I kind of lost all my friends.
Wow.
And I just got really involved at church and would hang out with the youth group and with the pastor, and which was a really good time. I remember kind of feeling like I had lost, some things, but then looking back later, I realized that needed to happen. Sometimes things need to die, and there needs to be this kind of this rebirth. And so that was definitely that time for me, where God had really done a new work, and it was time for the old to go, and then the new to be reborn. And so, yeah,
it sounds like that assurance of faith that you're talking about that you have now was given to you then. Like, and it sounds like you didn't know that's what you were looking for, right? Yeah. You're looking for, like, where's my brother? Your fear of salvation yet.
Yeah.
You then get this vision from the Lord, which I totally understand the visions from the Lord. It's a very powerful tool that I think he uses. He's used it in my life. And it just brings about this confidence that you can have in him. And it's a real huge driver of, like, hope.
Yes.
And so I think it's cool that he actually gave you that vision to assure you of, like, you can trust me. I have your brother. I also have you. And so I think that's just a really cool thing. And I think more people can stand to, like, hear things like that, because oftentimes those things can be seen as weird, or they can be seen as, oh, that's not for me. I'm not going to pay attention to that. But from that moment forward, you're like, this is it for me. I'm going to accept it. I'm going to run with it. And I think more people in the church need to hear just really encouraging stories like that.
Amen.
So along with, this point of really transformation for you moving forward, and you just really serving the Lord, stepping into leadership roles in ministry. From what I understand, at some point you became a youth pastor for some period of time. So, tell me about that and the thoughts, the events that led you to becoming a youth pastor, and what that experience was like. When it went about in your stage of life with this event?
So, I would have been in my early 20s. The church that we were going to, where I was a youth leader and had all those experiences. Because I was, a saxophone player, I got the opportunity to go on tour with a band.
Oh.
And so this band leader, they had come and done a big well, I guess he was it was the band and the speaker were the camp speaker, like a church camp speaker, and then also the worship band.
Okay, so it was some kind of a Christian band.
Yeah,
okay.
they were, yeah. And so they heard me play and invited me to sit in and play with them. And then they were like, "Oh, we really like this guy. Hey, do you want to go on tour with us?"
Oh, wow.
So I did, and we went for a while. It was really cool. Recorded, a CD and some different stuff. But then the band broke up. And so when I came back, the church that we were going through, it had some changes and some different things happen. And my parents had stopped going to that church and started going to another. And so I just went ahead and started going where my parents were at, which was another small church in Mesa. And a short while into being there, the youth pastor who was there had to step down. And it was a small, church of like 120 people. And I think the youth group was roughly about 10 to 12 kids.
Okay.
But the youth pastor had to step down, and so someone asked, because they knew that I worked with youth, and I think even from the get-go, I kind of started getting involved and just let them know, hey, if you need anything, I'd be happy to help, And so the pastor came to me and was like, would you consider being our youth pastor? And I was like, yeah, I can do that.
And how much of a commitment was this? Like a paid position, or
it was not paid?
Okay.
No, they were a small church, so I still worked full time as a painter. And youth group was on Friday nights, and it was. And I didn't have any leaders. That's why I've been so blown away by like how we do youth here with all the small group leaders, and
it is something, isn't it? And
incredible.
And the time that they put in, I'm still amazed. Like I think I tell some youth workers now and then, or like the pastors there. It's like I don't know how they find anyone to do this, because the time commitment. It's just like my hat goes off to them. What a blessing for how much.
They're amazing.
It is amazing. And what else was funny was that half the youth group had to be picked up.
Oh,
and so my uncle,
like to get rides to church,
that you would pick them up every week.
I was about to ask if you had a church van.
I would have to go. On Friday, I'd have to drive to Gilbert and fill up my car with 5 or 6 kids, and take them, and then the rest usually got rides. It was a neat experience, though. It's so funny. I was recently telling someone, if you've ever gone to a really small church, things, are that saying, a few people do a lot. Because that particular church at that time, they couldn't even afford to have a janitor.
Okay, yeah.
And so part of inheriting the youth group was also inheriting the job of being the church cleaners. And so we would have youth on Friday nights, and almost every Saturday morning, the youth group would come. We'd meet at the church at 8, and we would vacuum and clean the bathrooms. And 10, 12 kids, you can have a church cleaned easily in an hour.
Yeah.
And the thing is the kids loved it.
Wow.
It was like our standard youth activity.
Yeah.
A lot of times we would, we'd order a pizza, or we would make an activity at it. And in fact, if you know where the Nile Theater is in Mesa.
In downtown Mesa.
There was a period of time that was a church.
Okay.
And so that's where the church was.
That's cool.
So we would clean, the church and get it ready. And then sometimes we would just walk around Main Street, or, go down to wherever and get drinks or hang out, and back then that whole Main Street construction was going on with the light rail being put in.
Oh, okay.
And there was a Christian coffee shop right around the corner that was owned by someone from the church called Jehovah and Java Heavenly Blends. It's no longer there, but that was kind of our hangout spot, and the youth would hang out. So it was really neat. And it was while doing that I met my wife.
Okay.
So when I met Rachel, she almost immediately was, so our first 3 years of marriage, we were the youth pastors.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's how that happened.
So then, what brought that period to connect the dots between like ending that period and then eventually, if you want to just bullet points, whatever you want to share about ending, bringing that to a close and ending up at Red Mountain Community Church.
All right. Well, there's a few steps, but so we were youth pastors, and I was also going to Bible college that whole time.
Oh, okay.
And so at about that 3-year mark, I really had felt called to being a pastor. And so I had actually started candidating. And there was another young family that had started coming to the church, and the guy really felt called to youth. And so it just seemed like God had brought this person along, and they actually started coming and kind of serving alongside. And so there was a really smooth transition from me stepping down as youth pastor to this other guy stepping into that role, and he did a great job. And then I started candidating. We actually ended up moving to New York. I was a pastor for a year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in 2004. But what we didn't realize at the time is that the church really needed more of an interim pastor, and that was not quite communicated to us. And about 6 months into being in there, we realized that the worship pastor was coming back, and that
Is that the role you were filling?
I was the worship pastor / associate pastor / whatever needed to be done.
Okay.
/ Swiss Army knife.
Yeah. So I was doing a lot and working full time because it was not quite full pay.
Okay.
And so it was. That was a really hard season. It matured and grew us, because up until that point, I had always had a good job, and for the most part always made enough money to provide for our family, and I had really never experienced financial want. And then being there and being totally out of my element and not knowing anyone or having any connections, just being on the other side of the country, not knowing how we're going to pay all of our bills, we really had to trust in the Lord. And it was amazing how God, week after week, month after month, provided for us. And it really taught us to trust Him. I think I needed a lot of people say, do you feel like you miss God? Like, why would God have you move all the way over there just for you to come back? And it was like, not that I never didn't. I always trusted the Lord. Like, you think of that. You always say, thank you, Lord, and you're always grateful for what you have. But until you don't have it and you don't know how to get it, and you only can look up and say, God, we're like, a couple $100 short paying the rent, or, how are we going to do this, and just week after week, He provided and blessed us. People would like bring food, and drop it off. Although when you're that poor, you qualify for, WIC and food stamps. So we used to joke about how we didn't have any money, but we had food. We had some family visit once, like, we can't afford to go anywhere, but we'll eat. Like, there's plenty of food. We always had food. But okay, so the Lord ended up bringing us back, and Rachel and I and the kids ended up probably going to couple different churches just because of different transitional things and moving a couple times. But ultimately what brought us to Red Mountain, we had been going to another really good church in the valley, but doesn't really have much of youth programs. And so we were going, and we loved the church, we loved the preaching. But as our kids started becoming teenagers, ironically, my wife Rachel was invited to a Bible study here at the church. Okay. With Yvonne Vale. A lot of people know Yvonne. Oh yeah. She had invited Rachel, and my wife and her have known each other since they were kids, and so Rachel started coming regularly to Bible studies. And one day she comes home and says, "If we have any hope of our children marrying godly men and women, we need to go to a church that has godly men and women where they can be discipled and they can grow." And she had just begun to hear about all the things, that were happening and how the youth were. And so we did. And I'll never forget the very first Sunday we came, our kids all went to their small groups. And back then the Brays were youth leaders. Okay. And Mama Bray just like wrapped her arms around our daughter Sarah. And Sarah had never had any connections like with youth groups or nothing. Like she never felt like she fit in.
Wow.
And she just right from the start was like, oh my gosh, Mom. Like the kids were all like, they each loved their small group. They loved their youth leader. It's hard for people to believe because Judah, like everyone loves Judah, but there was a time that when Judah was little, that he really struggled to have friends and really struggled, and in fact, a very common prayer would be, you guys, will you pray that the Lord will bring me a friend? He just wanted one friend.
Oh, boy.
And Ben Bray just like from the start just attached himself to Judah. And like they were like best friends. Like Ben was so cool and so loving, and really through Ben and the rest of the youth group, like Judah just like this church was the exact fit, Of course, Gideon, everyone loves Gideon. He's never met a stranger that didn't love him, but
I think we're convinced everybody loves the Niemans.
We just have been so blessed by what the Lord has, done and how the Lord's used, the church to bless our family. Yeah.
So, about how long you been going to Red Mountain then?
I believe, I wish I could remember the year, but I know it's roughly 6 years. In fact, our first month was Pastor Bob Fox's last month.
Okay.
So I remember our first month, I heard his last 4 sermons.
Okay.
And then Kyle so however long ago that was.
Okay. Yep.
About 6 years ago.
So you've been embedded here for a while then.
Yeah.
Like, so what kinds of ministries have you found yourself getting involved in, and what kinds of thoughts or events drew you to involvement in those particular ministries?
So I think at some point, early on, maybe it was when we became members, they have you fill out a form like what are you interested in, or what things would you like to do?
Yep.
And so I must have, put in there something about being a youth leader, working with youth, and then music. And I think initially my initial thought was I just really wanted to be on the praise team because I have always played on a church praise team, since I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And so, we had Ryan Bruchette then, and so he contacted me and asked would I consider working with the youth, and so at
high school or junior high level?
At the time they were junior high. In fact, last night we just had the senior banquet for the seniors.
Okay.
And I started with them when they were starting 8th grade.
Oh, wow.
And so when they were the current seniors who are about to graduate, when they were starting the 8th grade, that's whenever I began to work with them. And and so then we transitioned up from junior high to high school, and that's what I love. I love this format, how we have leaders follow the kids up. It is awesome, and both I think for them, the security and stability that they have of having a leader who knows them and works with them and stays with them.
Yeah.
But even as a leader, just to watch, last night we got a chance to kind of just, pray over the kids and speak over them and, read scriptures that God had given us for each one. And it's amazing to me how much they've grown and matured, and seeing that, and see them, from just young adolescent boys to now young men who all love and are serving the Lord. And so it's really been a blessing, to be a part of that and to see that. Yeah.
If you were to engage in some attempted sanctified speculation, what do you suspect that the Lord has been doing in your life currently, or maybe revealing about Himself to you as we kind of wrap up here?
Oh man, humility. It's interesting. That's an interesting question. I went to the men's retreat just recently, and I saw that Alan was going to be preaching, and that the message was going to be on forgiveness. And I don't think of myself as being an unforgiving person or having bitterness or unforgiveness, but God ended up touching my heart in a whole different way. And I don't know. He just really, I think, believe it or not, forgiving myself. Sometimes I hold myself, hold things against myself, and or don't think that I'm able to, that I don't deserve this. I don't deserve this or that. And sometimes we have to realize and recognize that we are forgiven. That we are in the hands of the Lord, and He's doing a work in us, and He's already cast those things from the east, as far as the east is from the west, and He's forgiven us. And sometimes we have to just serve the Lord, and I don't know. I guess sometimes I still hold on to mistakes and things that I've done and think that I don't deserve, maybe some kind of a happiness or something. And I don't know. I just really came away from that retreat just really feeling loved by the Lord, really feeling forgiven. Just a renewed, love for my family and for my children and my wife. And we just really, I know I'm blessed.
Well, thanks so much, James. I appreciate you coming and just being so willing to open up and share. And this has been what I hoped it would be, getting to know kind of another side of you. So it'll make hanging out with you here in the green room all that much more meaningful going forward. So thanks so much, man.
Thank you. Lord bless you guys.
Okay, well, as I said, that was pretty much all that I'd hoped it would be, talking to James. So what stood out to you? What's maybe the first thing that comes to mind?
I think just his ability to recognize the blessing that the Lord is. He said that a lot, that we're so blessed. The Lord blessed us. He provided for us. And it's just cool to see somebody really express that in a passionate way. Even if it is in hindsight, or even recognize it in real time, like how the Lord was providing for him. And I think that's just so cool, because oftentimes in my life, it's really hard to recognize in real time how big of a blessing the Lord is. And so that's just encouraging to me to like pay attention to that, even for myself. And so it's just an encouraging story to hear. And I've known James for a while, and I feel like some of those things are new to me. Yeah. I'm just like, I know all of his kids, and I know how great of a joy they are, and just, it's a solid family. Yeah. Yeah. I thought of you just serving in junior high ministry when he was talking about just kind of like the reset in his life with his friendships that came after really having a new and fresh and fuller experience with the Lord. And was just thinking, man, I hope that's encouraging to maybe some junior high students or high school students or even college age students or folks that might be listening, just to realize that like you can get through those kinds of resets, even though it might be, really kind of difficult, and it can bring about some really good things. So that's stood out to me. I also, like at the end, I really appreciated just the nature of his thought process when he was talking about the men's retreat and realizing that he was dealing with a problem of not being able to forgive himself. And I noticed how his language shifted. He started with that, just using those words to describe what he was feeling. But the solution to it was not the one that the world gives us of like, well, you just have to choose to feel good about yourself. Instead, his realization, you could hear it in the change in his language, was that he had been forgiven, and he was letting go of his self-evaluation, as though ultimately our evaluation of ourselves is all that meaningful. And he was realizing the evaluation of the God of the universe that had provided forgiveness for him. And I just love that kind of turn in how he was processing and thinking through that kind of thing. Because I think we all have to figure out, how are we going to deal with those, the voice in our minds that's seeing our shortcomings, and we don't know how to deal with that, So, but I mean, there was so much. I mean, like, those are just two things, and I don't even feel like either one of those is like the main thing that he was talking about. Such like a rich conversation with so many different little points that
Oh, man. So I hope lots of people from all different kinds of stages of life in our church listen to this, because I think there's a lot for all kinds of different people in what James shared. Well, that is it for this episode of the Red Mountain Community Church podcast. A big thank you to Arian Rossi for organizing and editing the show, to Jessica Garcia for her oversight, and to the pastors who help recommend our guests. You can follow Red Mountain Community Church on Instagram and Facebook, where you can also leave us comments and suggestions to help make the show better. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening so you don't miss out on the next episode. And if by chance you want more of me blabbing on topics relevant to Christian geeks, you can check out my personal weekly show, the Christian Geek Central podcast. In the meantime, I'm Peter Franson.
I'm Kenny Walmsley.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on Sunday.